One aspect of the British Empire that most people don't really talk about, we do talk about to an extent the idea that it covered the world, that the sun never set on the British Empire, as the old quote goes. Yet, I think we don't really talk about is how difficult it is to manage an empire that big, how logistics, how time and separation creates its own level of problems. Combine that with a general sense of superiority and arrogance and all sorts of other fun things that go along with colonialism, and you get a environment that when the wars start, it becomes very difficult to manage, particularly in a period where there are no airplanes, where there are no airships, where there are no automobiles really quite yet. And so trying logistically to get things where you want them to go is kind of tricky. And with that, let's talk about the Boer War. Crioso, and welcome back to the Welsh History Podcast, episode 256, the first modern British conflict, the Boer War. Today we turn to a conflict that has shaped the final years of the Victorian era and left deep marks in the towns and villages across Wales, called, of course, the Boer War, fought between 1899 and 1902. It was a clash between the British Empire and two Boer republics of South Africa. It was a conflict of imperial ambition, political controversy, and human tragedy. Wales was deeply involved, of course, in all of it, as was most places, including Canada, as an example, because we too sent soldiers there. Welsh soldiers served in every phase of the war. Communities raised funds and supplies. Welsh political leaders, by David Lloyd George, confronted hostile crowds as they challenged the war. Welsh nurses and Welsh critics shaped public discussions at home through humanitarian work and moral debate. In this episode, we will recount the major events of the war and then later focus on the involvement of Welsh soldiers, supporters, and opponents. We'll hear from their letters, their diaries, and their newspapers. All of these sources, of course, are important, and it helps us to avoid making too many speculative leaps. What follows, of course, is drawn directly from what we can find, and that's important to keep in mind. The Boer War did not erupt suddenly in 1899. It grew from decades of political tension. Remember the Zulu War that we discussed a little while ago. It also grew out of economic rivalry and diplomatic failures and cultural conflict in southern Africa. Understandably, why the war began requires looking at the long history of British ambition in the region, the rapid transformation of the Transvaal after the discovery of gold, and the breakdown in negotiations between the British government and the Boer republics. Throughout the 19th century, British officials sought to consolidate their influence across southern Africa. Colonial office correspondence and parliamentary debates of the 1870s make it clear that many British statesmen hoped to create a unified region under British authority. In their view, the existence of two independent Boer republics, the South African Republic and the Transvaal and Orange Free State, complicated stability and hindered the development of a cohesive political and economic system. Earlier annexation of Transvaal in 1877, followed by a successful revolt during the First Boer War, left behind a residue of mistrust and a belief amongst many British leaders that the region's long-term future required British direction. This ambitious ideal collided with a dramatic and unforeseen development. In 1886, gold was discovered along the Witwatersrand in the Transvaal. Previously a rural farming republic, suddenly became one of the richest territories in the world. Mining companies' records, British financial reports, and contemporary newspapers show that the magnitude of this transformation. It created whole new situations and a whole new viewpoint on the value of the area. Tens of thousands of foreign workers arrived, most of them British. These newcomers became known as Uitlanders or Outlanders. They generated most of the tax revenue, yet under President Paul Kruger's government, they were given almost no political rights. Their inability to vote without long periods of residency became a major grievance, documented in petitions sent to Queen Victoria and in the British diplomatic reports during the 1890s. Many of the Uitlanders simply wanted representation, but their mining magnates who controlled the industry pushed for a far greater political influence. This tension would explode with the Jameson Raid of 1895 to 1896, planned by Cecil Rhodes, a name familiar if you know British African history, and carried out by Dr. Leander Starr Jameson. The raid attempted to spark an uprising amongst the Uitlanders in Johannesburg, but the uprising never materialized and the raid failed. The event is well documented in Official Committee of Inquiry and the Cape Parliamentary Papers, which reveal the depth of British involvement. Its failure humiliated the British diplomatically and convinced the Boer leadership that the British intended to overthrow their government by force. The raid deepened suspicion on both sides and made future negotiations far more difficult. As you can imagine, that kind of comes when you're trying to carry out a conspiracy against another government. They don't typically love that very much, as you can obviously tell. After the raid, tensions focused on attempts to resolve the political rights of Uitlanders. Between 1897 and 1899, Sir Alfred Milner, British High Commissioner, entered into negotiations with the Boer leadership. The most famous of these meetings took place in Bloemfontein in May of 1899. Diplomatic telegrams and meeting minutes show that Milner insisted on rapid and substantial voting rights for Uitlanders, while Kruger offered more limited reforms. At the heart of the disagreement was a profound lack of trust. Milner believed that the Transvaal government intended to exclude British subjects permanently, while Kruger believed that expanding rights would allow the British residents and mining industry to dominate and eventually absorb the Republic. The negotiations ended without agreement. And you can understand the suspicion that the Boer people must have had. You can understand that the Brits don't have a great reputation in this situation. And so mistrust would be key. It would be part of the problem for the colonial powers in every place, regardless of who lived there. The deal with governments at large was always going to be shaky and very scary for these people. As diplomatic talks faltered, the British government increased troop deployments to South Africa. These reinforcements, recorded in Army estimates of 1899 to 1900, were widely reported in the press and interpreted by the Boer government as preparations for war. Feeling encircled and convinced that delay would leave them strategically weaker, the Transvaal and Orange Free States issued an ultimatum on the 9th of October 1899, demanding the withdrawal of British troops, an end to further reinforcements, and arbitration on all outstanding issues must be done. The text of this ultimatum appears in the British government's Blue Book on South African Affairs. Obviously, Britain rejected this, and the Boer republics declared war on the 11th of October. Behind these political and economic tensions, of course, lay deeper cultural and ideological differences. British officials often viewed the Boer republics as resistant to progress and obstructive to imperial unity, something clearly reflected in missionary reports and parliamentary debates of the period. Boer leaders feared the erosion of their language, religion, and political independence in the face of British expansion. These disagreements extended to questions about African labor and governance as well. Both sides believed their way of life was under threat and that this cultural friction intensified the political dispute. The Second Boer War, of course, begins in the 11th of October, 1899, when the Boer republics of Transvaal and Orange Free State issued their ultimatum demanding that British troops withdraw from their borders. the British refusal led directly to open conflict. The early phase of the war went badly for Britain. December 1899 became known as Black Week. British forces were defeated in 3 battles in quick succession: Stormberg, Magnefontein, and Colenso. These losses and their casualty lists were documented in official dispatches written in the London Gazette in January of 1900. The British responded by sending large reinforcements under Field Marshal Lord Robert with his second in command, Lord Kitchener, a name that will become very well known to everybody in short order. The British advance was swift across the early 1900s. Bloemfontein fell in March, Pretoria fell in June, and with these victories, the war still, however, did not end. The Boers shifted to guerrilla tactics, using mobility and familiarity with the terrain to tie down large British forces. Kitchener, in his own way, responded with scorched earth tactics, the construction of blockhouses and the creation of what would become called concentration camps for Boer civilians. These camps became infamous thanks to Emily Hobhouse, who we'll discuss a lot more in the next edition of this podcast, whose first-hand investigation in early 1901 resulted in published reports that shocked the British public. The war finally ended with the Treaty of Vereniging on 31st of May, 1902. So that is the war as it actually sketched out happened. It's not in depth. Don't expect me to go into massive blow-by-blow depth here. That will come more in our World War I discussions. But it is important to remember that that's the gist of how the war went and how things broke down. And we'll go more in depth on the human cost in the next episode, so be aware of that. But for now, let's focus back on Wales and its contribution. Wales contributed thousands of soldiers to the conflict, serving in Welsh regiments, the South Wales Borderers, and the Imperial Yeomanry. Many of their experiences survived in letters, diaries, and newspaper reports. The 1st Battalion Welsh Regiment arrived in South Africa in November of 1899. They were part of the advance on Bloemfontein and later on Pretoria. Their movements, long marches, and exposure to disease appeared in historical records of the Welsh Regiment. One of the clearest personal voices of this regiment comes from Private John Fieldinghouse. His letters, printed in South Wales Daily News in April 1900, describe the heat and dust and the exhaustion that accompanied the march towards Bloemfontein. He wrote of comrades collapsing from sunstroke and how the veldt seemed endless. The other regiment, the South Wales Borderers, or the 2nd Battalion of the South Wales Borderers, took part in some of the hardest fighting from the entire war. Their involvement in the battles of Colenso, Spionkop, Valkrans, and the Tugela Heights operations are well documented. So let's have a look at these specific battles and a little bit on the contributions of various people involved. The Battle of Colenso was fought on the 15th of December, 1899, and was part of General Redvers Buller's first attempt to relieve Ladysmith. The South Wales Borderers were in Major General Hart's brigade on the left flank. Buller's official dispatches, published in the London Gazette on the 8th of February, 1900, record that Hart's brigade advanced in close formation towards what they believed to be a fordable crossing of the Tugela River. 4 riflemen concealed in trenches along the riverbank opened fire before the brigade could even deploy. The South Wales Borderers suffered casualties while attempting to form up under this intense fire. The South Wales Daily News, on the 6th of January, 1900, printed accounts from surviving soldiers describing the shock of the ambush, the difficulty in moving through thorn-covered ground while rifles were being fired at them. A Sergeant J. Williams, writing in the South Wales Echo on the 20th of December, 1899, confirmed that many of the Welsh believed that they were approaching an undefended crossing until the first shot struck the column. If we move to another battle, the Battle of Spionkop, it was fought on the 23rd and 24th of January 1900, and has become one of the most tragic British defeats of the war. While a summit assault was carried out by other regiments, the South Wales borderers were engaged in the lower slopes and took part in communications, reinforcement, and rescue operations. The death of Captain Owen Lloyd of Brecon is recorded in the London Gazette Dispatch on the 8th of February, 1900. The Brecon County Times on the 17th of February noted that Lloyd had been killed while attempting to move forward under fire. The Weekly Mail on the 10th of February reported that stretcher bearers from the South Wales borderers faced rifle fire as they attempted to carry wounded men down the hillside. It was a bloody and horrific defeat. However, after Spion Kop, this same regiment continued with Buller's forces during the renewed efforts to relieve Ladysmith. This included the battles at Valkrantz in early February and the series of attacks on the Tugla Heights. I'm sure I'm saying that wrong, I apologize. Later that month. These operations finally broke during the Boer defense and allowed the relief of Ladysmith on the 28th of February 1900. The South African War Casualty Roll records several Welsh fatalities from these engagements. While these two main regiments were fighting, there were still around Ladysmith others that were involved, such as the Welsh Regiment and the Welsh Yeomanry, which were active in the Orange Free State and northern Transvaal. The Welsh Regiment was involved on the advance on Pretoria. It took part in the operations in Bloemfontein in the 13th of March 1900 and on the later advance on Pretoria, as I just mentioned. These movements were recorded and are important. In July of 1900, so we're now almost a year after the war was declared, the Welsh Regiment helped seal mountain passes that trapped Boer General Prinsloo's forces. The Times reported the capture of more than 2,000 Boer prisoners on the 1st of August, 1900. Meanwhile, the Welsh Yeomanry were involved in the guerrilla wars that were going on in the latter part of the war. Glamorgan, Denbighshire, and Montgomeryshire Yeomanry units took part in patrols, blockhouse construction, and anti-guerrilla operations during this period. In the diary of Lieutenant Sir Charles Maclaren, it records skirmishes near Pretoria and the difficult searches for grazing and water for various horses and troops. Trooper William Harries of Llandilio wrote home about skirmishes and patrol hardships. His letters obviously carry a lot of the problems that these soldiers were having. Yet, through all this, there were support for the fight and for the British right to dominate in South Africa at home. Wales produced strong public support for the war in many towns, particularly amongst the middle class and conservative citizens. Patriotic funds, such as the Welsh Patriotic Fund, was established in October of 1899. The Times and Western Mail recorded fundraising events across Cardiff, Swansea, Newport, and Bangor. Sewing circles produced supplies for soldiers. Chapels hosted concerts and collections. At Carnarvon Station, there were more than 2,000 people gathered to cheer for the departure of the local yeomanry unit in January of 1900. So even while we're talking about negatives, and we'll talk far more about the negatives in the next episode, it's important to keep in mind that in every war, in every situation, there are always those that defend whatever war is going on and will be positive towards those fighting in that war. The consequences of that will continue to be problematic, of course, in later parts of the war when people start to realize the cost of war. And many of those who may have been on the sidelines cheering as the soldiers left may not have been so delighted later on when they have to deal with the consequence of those battles and the human cost of them. This will be revisited very soon as we get closer to World War I, because we will see a very similar set of circumstance. The idea of going off and fighting for the British cause being a popular thing until it's not. And you can imagine that continues to be a question. Of course, in amongst all this are the religious leaders and their voices. Many of the Welsh nonconformist leaders were not as supportive towards this war, and often would, if they did support it, would only do so cautiously. In 1900, for example, the Methodist Assembly contained prayers for soldiers and for a just peace. Principal Thomas Charles Edwards spoke of duty as reported in the Ingening. It would, of course, show that things were changing, that caution, that the idea of cost of war, of human tragedy, were now suddenly building in the minds of many people. And there was a concern that now maybe this isn't such a great thing. Maybe this isn't a great way of pushing for unity and empire and taking on the ne'er-do-wells and wrongdoers as seen and justified by the British government. But maybe, just maybe, it's actually in the wrong, and maybe, just maybe, isn't always as correct. Now, that's not everybody, may not even be most people in this period, but it's definitely happening. And there are definitely people that will get louder about this over the coming years. And it's important to keep in mind that there's always other people on the other side that aren't always happy about these things, and they want to express themselves and often do in free countries. And we'll hear from them shortly. That's the thing with most of these colonial battles is you start off, especially in this period, because you're starting to get news that's coming rapidly, right? Telegrams are flying, giving reports of the battles, of the wars, but it's also quickly reporting the cost of war. And all of this is kind of creating a sense of a visualization of war in a way that hadn't really been before. The U.S. Civil War really is one of the first examples of this, where you have, because there's obvious telegraph abilities on every front, the fact that there are photographers there every day for the war, and the war is really tightly encapsulated in one country and in one area, it makes it a lot easier for this to be published and to get out. And so it's not as far away and lengthily delayed as, say, maybe wars in previous history would have been. The battles of the 100 Years' War weren't exactly covered by reporters wandering around and writing reports on, the decisions of various generals and various kings. It just wasn't possible. And so this is the first time where media is having a real impact. It's really hitting people just how vividly this is changing. And it's something we've seen, like I said, in the Civil War, but also in Crimea, in the Crimean War. There was newspaper reports and coverage, and it did have an effect on public opinion back home in a way that hadn't really been as strong before. I mean, yes, there was times, but keep in mind that most details, especially from great distances, were taking months to get there, not weeks, or in this case, minutes and hours. We're seeing a great change in how everything's creating an idea about how to cover and how to view war in its modern sense. And it's changing how people react to it, which will again create an issue where governments will say, maybe we need to manage what's being spread to deal with the fact that it's kind of depressing people back home and making them sad and making them oppose our war that we really, really had to do. And so we kind of get the backlash to all this later, and we see it in World War One, where you get censorship and a constant sense of, well, maybe we don't want this out in the public eye. Maybe we don't want to, create a sense of defeatism amongst our population. And all of this kind of combines itself into the modern life of warfare. Again, something we'll talk about in further detail down the road, but it's something I wanted to keep in mind because it's important to remember that we're only starting to get to that stage. And a lot of things are very jingoistic, and reporting is very patriotic and upbeat until it isn't. And then papers who oppose the war will be very negative and will make sure that they hit on every highlight. So you'll see all of that kind of coming out, which I think is important to note, that what we see in modern times existed before. There's always a way to make money off of print media and other kinds of media. So you're always looking for an angle to try and sell more papers. And one of the ways you do that is by being either fantastically for or fantastically opposed to whatever's going on. This is not new, guys. I guess that's what I'm saying. That's where the term yellow journalism comes from, is in these circumstance of trying to win a dollar on trying to change public opinion, and how that change was not always built on truth, but rather on speculation, on straight up lies in some cases, and in some cases on trying to buck up what was going on to the advance and to the detriment of the truth, I would argue. But with all that said and done, I'd like to thank you all for listening and viewing today. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, you can always reach me at the Welsh History Podcast at gmail.com, or you can reach out to me on pretty much most of my social medias at Welsh History Pod. Love it when you do. Honestly, I try to reply to everybody who does, and especially at those because it's easier for me to get to than some of the other ones. If you want to reach out on Facebook, you can do so at facebook.com/Welsh History Podcast. And as always, thank you once again for listening. If you would like to donate or help support the podcast in a different way, you can do so at patreon.com/Welsh History. Thank you, one and all. Hope you're having a great year, a great day. Talk to you later. Take care. Bye-bye. Welsh History Podcast is a member of the Evergreen Podcast Network. To find more information on them, you can do so at evergreenpodcasts.com. Thanks for listening.